1925. Millions now living will never die. Millions now living will never die was exclaimed by Rutherford in a series of public lectures starting in 1918. This was related to his prophecy that the earthly resurrection would commence in 1925, with the return to life of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and became the focus of the preaching work in the following years. This video provides quotes regarding Rutherford's failed doctrine and shows how in recent times Watchtower dishonestly presents this historical episode. The failure of Watchtower's 1914 predictions for the end of this system and death of Russell in 1916 left his followers in disarray. After legalistic wrangling, Rutherford became Watchtower's next president. Credit must go to Rutherford for his ability to rebuild the religion. He was able to reignite urgency into the remaining followers by announcing through public discourse in February 1918 that the world has ended, millions now living may never die. In March, the title was changed to the more compelling, The world has ended, millions now living will never die. In 1920, Millions Now Living Will Never Die was released, and in 1921 The Harp of God, carrying on the cover an inscription, Proof Conclusive that Millions Now Living Will Never Die. The Proclaimer's book, page 425, relates, "What an exciting message they proclaimed. Millions now living will never die." Brother Rutherford had given a discourse on this subject in 1918. It was also the title of a 128-page booklet published in 1920. From 1920 through 1925, that same subject was featured again and again around the world in public meetings in all areas where speakers were available and in upwards of 30 languages. Reading brief mention of this topic in the Proclaimer's book, one could be mistaken for thinking 1925 was of little relevance in the history of Jehovah's Witnesses. Yet this was the defining prophecy of Rutherford's leadership. Largely unknown by most Jehovah's Witnesses today, this was the focus of the Watchtower preaching work between 1918 and 1925. Millions Now Living Will Never Die introduced Rutherford's prediction that the earthly resurrection was to begin in 1925, starting with the faithful men of old, men such as Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. Expectations for 1925 included the end of Christendom, the return of earth to paradise, the resurrection of the dead onto earth, the Zionistic teaching of the re-establishment of Palestine. The following quotes outline these expectations. Millions Now Living Will Never Die, pages 88 and 89 said, "What then should we expect to take place? The chief thing to be restored is the human race to life. And since other scriptures definitely fix the fact that there will be a resurrection of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and other faithful ones of old, and that these will have the first favour, we may expect 1925 to witness the return of these faithful men of Israel from the condition of death, being resurrected and fully restored to perfect humanity and made the visible legal representatives of the new order of things on earth. At that time the earthly phase of the kingdom shall be recognized." The Harp of God, page 340 said, "Hence these faithful men may be expected on earth within the next few years." The Way to Paradise from 1925, pages 224 to 227 said, "The year 1926 would therefore begin about October 1st, 1925. We should therefore expect shortly after 1925 to see the awakening of Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Melchizedek, Job, Moses, Samuel, David, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, John the Baptist, and others mentioned in the 11th chapter of Hebrews. No doubt, Many boys and girls who read this book will live to see Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Daniel, and those other men of old come forth in the glory of their better resurrection, perfect in mind and body. The world and all the present conveniences will seem strange to them at first, but they will soon become accustomed to the new methods. They may have some amusing experiences at first, for they never saw telephones, radios, automobiles, electric lights, aeroplanes, steam engines, and many other things so familiar to us. The Way to Paradise described 1925 as the year for God's favour returning to the Jewish people, Jerusalem becoming capital of the world, and ancient worthies being awakened. It goes on to make the following outrageous predictions. The Bible and the Bible in stone, the Pyramid of Giza, give the date 1914 for the beginning of the Great Change. History proves that the ouster proceedings began promptly on time. Prophecy indicates that 1925 to 1926 will see the greater part of the ousting completed. All the world's statesmen are dreading the next few years. When you take up a more advanced study of the Bible, you will find that the year 1925 AD is particularly marked in prophecy. Of course, it will take some time to get things in smoothly running order after the great stress between now and 1926. It may be 10 years or more before you get your home all fixed up and the gardens bringing forth the luscious fruits and appetizing vegetables in abundance. Even if it takes a while longer, you will be that much better prepared. You will have secured the services of the best decorators you can find. Some of them used to be undertakers, but since there are no more people dying, they have had to seek a new occupation. Their experience as undertakers prepared them to become decorators with very little difficulty. The Bulletin in October 1920 included an outline on how to introduce the topic of 1925 when preaching. Here the script goes, "Good morning. Do you know that millions now living will never die? I mean just what I say, that millions now living are never going to die. The Finished Mystery, the posthumous work of Pastor Russell, tells why there are millions now living who will never die, and if you can keep alive until 1925, you have excellent chances of being one of them. It is an absolute fact stated in every book of the Bible, foretold by every prophet of the Bible." Rutherford gloated that those criticising the 1925 predictions would fail. Golden Age 1924 February 13 said, "But all the enemies of the cause of present truth in the earth are fervently hoping that the Bible students will not be so successful in 1925 in looking for the right thing at the right time as they were in 1914. If they are, however, it will be the other fellow that will have to do the explaining, and not we." Rutherford wrote that the chronological predictions he had made were of God himself, and 1925 was proclaimed a fixed date beyond doubt. Watchtower 1922 July 1st said, "This chronology is not of man, but of God. The addition of more proofs removes it entirely from the realm of chance into that of proven certainty. The chronology of present truth is not of human origin." Watchtower 1922 September 1 said, "The date 1925 is even more distinctly indicated by the Scriptures because it is fixed by the law God gave to Israel. Viewing the present situation in Europe, one wonders how it will be possible to hold back the explosion much longer, and that even before 1925, the great crisis will have reached and probably passed." Watchtower 1923 April 1st said, "Our thought is that 1925 is definitely settled by the Scriptures. As to Noah, the Christian now has much more upon which to base his faith than Noah had upon which to base his faith in a coming deluge." Watchtower 1924. "The year 1925 is a date definitely and clearly marked in Scriptures, even more clearly than that of 1914. Could there be any more direct evidence of an organisation that promoted false prophecy in the name of God? How could Rutherford say that his followers had more reason to accept his prediction of 1925 than Noah had to believe the words directly spoken by Jehovah? What was the basis for claiming the scriptures so definitely prove the earthly resurrection would begin in 1925? Millions now living said 70 jubilees of 50 years each would be a total of 3,500 years. That period of time beginning 1575 before AD 1, of necessity, would fall or would end in the fall of the year 1925, at which time the type ends and the great antitype must begin. The Way to Paradise explained it this way: 70 times 50 are 3,500. The whole period would therefore have been 3,500 years from the time the Jews entered Canaan until all the types would have been fulfilled. As they entered Canaan 1,575 years before Christ, there would be 1,925 years of types after Christ, or 1925 AD. Sad indictment on human gullibility that Watchtower followers can accept such flimsy evidence as unquestionable proof. Rutherford started backpedaling on such certainties. The Watchtower 1925 in February stated, "How much of all this will come to pass in 1925 is not stated. At present we do not find any definite date beyond 1926 indicated in the scriptures. When the Bible students found 1914 in the Bible, they heralded it far and wide. But the Lord left the curtain down at that date until we had reached it. God set his seal upon 1914, and the work started that year is still going on. We find the date 1925 to 1926 clearly indicated in the prophetic outline, and the Lord has not lifted the curtain sufficiently for us to see distinctly beyond." Increase, then decrease. After 1918, the Millions teaching became the central focus of the preaching effort, being delivered through a series of public lectures by Rutherford and other brothers. These were advertised in local newspapers, as displayed in the following clippings. Preaching that the earthly resurrection would commence in 1925 resulted in tremendous growth for the Watchtower Society. Watchtower in 1960, May 1, says, "This resulted in bringing into the sanctuary many more to be members of this remnant consecrated by Jehovah. This was evident from the increasing attendance at the annual celebration of the Lord's evening meal. 32,661 participating in 1922, 42,000 in 1923, 62,696 in 1924, and 90,434 in 1925. What it doesn't mention is that the converse occurred after 1925 came and went without incidents. No figures were reported for 1926 or 1927, but in 1928 there were less than half that of 1925, with memorial attendance of only 17,380 and 44,000 average publishers. It is estimated that as many as 75% of publishers left the religion, and by 1935 memorial attendance was still only 63,000. It took until 1940 to once again reach the same number of Watchtower followers as the 1925 era. Who were the Millions? Russell had proposed that followers of the Watchtower Society were to go to heaven, whilst most of the remainder of humanity would survive Armageddon to be educated personally by Jesus in Paradise Earth. In the New Creation, he wrote, "He takes mankind as he finds them, and during the millennial age will deal with each individual of the world according to his own particular condition, having mercy upon the meek and requiring more of the stronger." Rutherford continued to promote this teaching. In the new system, freed from the influence of Satan, Jesus would directly teach all people and give them the opportunity to choose if they wished to live forever serving him. Salvation was not contingent on becoming a Watchtower follower or even a believer in Jesus. In fact, the churches were criticised for teaching that their members exclusively would be saved. In Millions, he wrote, "The church systems would have the people believe that only those who become church members can be saved. The Bible never taught any such doctrine. Jesus died not only for those who will constitute the members of the church, but for all. It would be impossible for the human race, therefore, to accept the gift of life everlasting before it is offered. It will be offered only in God's due time, and the divine plan shows that his due time is after the seed of promise is developed, after the kingdom is set up, and then each one in his order will be brought to a knowledge that a plan of redemption exists and that the way is open for him to accept the terms of it and live. It is reasonable to conclude that millions of people now on the earth will be still on the earth in 1925. Then, based upon the promises set forth in the divine word, we must reach the positive and indisputable conclusion that millions now living will never die." The Harp of God went into great detail to explain God's generosity in saving the majority of humankind to be educated in this new system of things. After referencing Isaiah 35 verses 4 to 6 to describe life in this earthly new system, it went on to say, "When these great miracles begin to be performed in the earth, then the most skeptical, it is hoped, will believe that the Lord Jesus reigns." Page 333 describes God's promise to Noah to never again smite every living thing as proof Armageddon will not result in a great human slaughter. The majority of mankind practice unrighteousness, and these are the ones that will be given the opportunity to learn to practice righteousness during the reign of the Messiah. This was a fair concept that showed God's love and reasonableness towards humankind. Current misapplication. The Proclaimer's book properly indicates that early Bible students believed the majority of worldly people would survive Armageddon. Proclaimers, page 163 says, "Bible students understood that people then living, mankind in general, had the opportunity to survive right into the time of restitution, and that they would then be educated in Jehovah's requirements for life. If obedient, they would gradually attain to human perfection. If rebellious, they would in time be destroyed forever." More often, though, the Watchtower misleadingly indicates that the teaching of millions now living was over-optimism, as if the teaching back then coincided with the current doctrine that only Jehovah's Witnesses would be saved onto earth as part of the great crowd. Watchtower in 1963 said, "The millions now living will never die slogan applied only to the great crowd of other sheep mentioned in the scriptures of Revelation 7:9 and John 10:16, whose destiny is an earthly paradise." Watchtower 1997 said, "In the early 1920s, a featured public talk presented by Jehovah's Witnesses was entitled 'Millions Now Living Will Never Die.' This may have reflected over-optimism at the time, but today that statement can be made with full confidence." Watchtower 1985, "This must be the class of persons that are often described as the millions now living that will never die. Today it is thrilling actually to see millions of these being marked for preservation, as they put on the true Christian personality in the dedicated relationship to Jehovah through Christ Jesus. Presented at that time was conclusive proof identifying the great crowd of Revelation 7 verse 9 with the Lord's other sheep of John 10:16, with the Jehonadab class, with those marked in the forehead for survival, with the millions now living who will never die, and with the sheep." These statements are complete falsehoods. Rutherford's message was the very opposite of what these articles claim. He was not preaching that millions of Watchtower followers will never die. In fact, the few thousand Bible students all expected to die and go to heaven, as either the great crowd or the little flock. At that time, the teaching was that the great crowd would go to heaven. The millions that Rutherford was referring to, who would never die, were the rest of humankind alive at that time. Shifting blame. It is reprehensible that from the moment Rutherford's prediction proved wrong, and continuing to this day, the governing body shifted the blame for the false expectation away from themselves and onto the members. Watchtower 1926 said, "It was stated in the Millions book that we might reasonably expect them to return shortly after 1925, but this was merely an expressed opinion. Besides, it is still shortly after 1925. Watchtower 1926 said, "Some anticipated that the work would end in 1925, but the Lord did not so state." Yearbook 1975, "Instead of its being considered a probability, they read into it that it was a certainty." Watchtower 1993, "Ever since the 1870s, Bible students had been serving with a date in mind. First 1914, then 1925. Now they realise that they must serve for as long as Jehovah wishes." Proclaimers, "On the basis of what we said there, many hoped that perhaps the remaining ones of the little flock would receive their heavenly reward by 1925. Though mistaken, they eagerly shared it with others." Rather than accept responsibility for stumbling fellows with their false 1925 teachings, Watchtower derogatively describes these ones as chaff. Proclaimers, page 633, says, "Although these tests resulted in a sifting and some blew away like chaff when wheat is winnowed, others remained firm." Importance downplayed. Proclaimers deceptively claims that the failure of 1925 affected just a small minority, whereas we have seen from Watchtower statistics that over half left the organisation. Proclaimers says the year 1925 came and went. Some abandoned their hope, but the vast majority of the Bible students remained faithful. An interesting tactic that downplays the importance is seen in the following quote. It is admitted that attendance dropped in France and Switzerland, which misleadingly makes it seem other countries were not equally affected. Here it said, "But some of their time calculations and the expectations that they associated with these gave rise to serious disappointments. Following 1925, meeting attendance dropped dramatically in some congregations in France and Switzerland." Similar intellectual dishonesty can be identified in the 1980 yearbook, which misquotes from the Watchtower of 1926 in an attempt to downplay the sentiment of 1925. Notice how only half a sentence is quoted, with a full stop replacing a semicolon. Yearbook 1980, page 62 says, "Indicative of this testing was the question meeting held by Brother Rutherford during the Basel, Switzerland Assembly, which took place May 1-3, 1926. Question: Have the ancient worthies returned? Answer: Certainly they have not returned. No one has seen them, and it would be foolish to make such an announcement. It was stated in the Millions book that we might reasonably expect them to return shortly after 1925, but this was merely an expressed opinion. Full stop." What the 1926 Watchtower actually said was, "This was merely an expressed opinion, semicolon, besides, it is still shortly after 1925. When discussing the 1918 March 31st lecture, Watchtower 2010, February 15, uses the word may instead of will, despite the scanned image showing the lecture used the word will in the title. It says, "The anointed followers of Christ have been extending the invitation since as far back as 1918. In that year, the public talk entitled Millions Now Living May Never Die offered hope that many will gain life in a paradise earth after the Battle of Armageddon. Not only is using the word may deceptive, it covers over the absolute conviction that Rutherford was implanting in his followers that the new system would arrive in 1925. Defining prophecy. The 1925 teaching seems to have originated between 1914 and 1916, whilst Russell was still living, but without his consent. In 1916, the Watchtower quoted a letter asking, "Dearly beloved pastor, A sister tells us that the class there are teaching that the church must not expect to be glorified until 1925, and that this is your thought. Russell replied, "Our kindest thought must be that they are not giving much heed to its teachings. Otherwise, they would know from its columns that we are not looking forward to 1925, nor to any other date." Shortly after Russell's death, Rutherford introduced 1925 as doctrine. Whether this originated with Rutherford or some other person, this became Rutherford's defining prophecy, as he used it to rebuild Watchtower membership after the failure and disappointment of 1914. However, it was the failure of 1925 that resulted in even more important consequences for today, as it led to Rutherford embarking on a dramatic overhaul of Watchtower doctrine and distancing his followers from Russell. Following the failure of 1925, almost all of Russell's time prophecy predictions were discarded by Rutherford. Furthermore, it was stated that between 1918 and 1919, Jesus cleansed the Watchtower Society, in effect implying that the time of Russell was one of uncleanness, and it was under Rutherford that Jesus chose the organisation as his sole provision for salvation. Rutherford distanced his followers from other Christians by stating most of Christendom's symbols and holidays were pagan, and use of the word Jehovah began to be emphasised, leading to the name change of Watchtower followers from Bible students to Jehovah's Witnesses. Finally, in 1935, the great crowd was moved from heaven to earth to become the sole survivors of Armageddon. These changes made it simple to introduce a concept of narrow salvation, the concept that only a handful of the world were deserving salvation. Conveniently, survivors had to belong to one earthly organisation, the Watchtower Society. God was now prepared to kill billions of people, most that had never even heard of the Watchtower organisation. The Bible explains that Jesus' ransom was for all mankind, even the ungodly. Romans 5 verse 6 says, "For indeed Christ, while we were yet weak, died for ungodly men at the appointed time." 2 Corinthians 5:14 says, "For the love that Christ has compels us, because this is what we have judged, that one man died for all." Rutherford's post-1925 belief structure removed the value of Jesus' sacrifice from all mankind and placed followers alone amongst the living as worthy of its benefits. This unfortunate view eliminates most of the value of Jesus' sacrifice for those alive at Armageddon and paints a cruel and unjust God. This viewpoint cannot be justified by reason or scripture, yet it is common amongst fundamentalist groups due to being an effective way to encourage membership and prevent defection. Millions Now Living Will Never Die had its first failure in 1925 when the earthly return of Abraham failed to materialize. Time has proven this prophecy false beyond doubt, as there are no longer millions alive that were alive when Rutherford made this proclamation in 1918. As of 2016, there were estimated to be only 450,000 centurions still alive on Earth.